the story of civilization, a half-century epic of the human mind. Welcome to the Deep Sight Podcast channel. I am your time travel navigator, Lawrence Stardust. In previous episodes, we discussed Sapiens, a brief history of humankind, exploring how Homo sapiens rose from the African savanna to the pinnacle of the world through the power of fictional stories. We also delved into the Talmud, appreciating the debates and wisdom of Jewish sages across millennia. Most people's interest in history begins with a single fascinating book. That's how it was for me as well. I created a video series on human civilization precisely because I found myself unsatisfied with even the grandest works. No matter how ambitious, they always seemed to skim over topics, and the questions they raised often had no answers waiting to be found. Because behind every answer, there's always another why. Today, I will introduce you to a book of this very kind, a true monumental work, not because of its thickness, but because it took half a century to measure the entire journey of human civilization. This book is called The Story of Civilization. Its author, Will Durant, was born in 1885 in Massachusetts to an Irish immigrant family. His life did not begin smoothly. At 12, he was sent to a Catholic reform school, but was expelled, and had to rely on self-study to eventually gain admission to university. He later entered Columbia University, where he studied under the renowned pragmatist philosopher John Dewey, a fellow student of Huxi, and earned his PhD in philosophy in 1917. Durant first rose to fame with The Story of Philosophy. This book presented the lives and ideas of history's major philosophers, from Socrates and Plato to Nietzsche and Dewey, in an engaging, storytelling style. It liberated philosophy from the academic ivory tower, making Kant and Nietzsche accessible to ordinary readers. The Story of Philosophy was translated into 18 languages and sold over 3 million copies. The success of this book gave the Durants financial freedom, allowing them to travel the world multiple times and eventually devote 40 years to writing the story of civilization. But Durant was not content to write only about philosophy. At 44, he made a grand resolution to spend the rest of his life writing a complete history of human civilization for the ordinary reader. This ambition became a super marathon, lasting nearly half a century. Initially, Durant planned 5 volumes, but his ambition expanded with each installment. From the publication of the first volume, Our Oriental Heritage, in 1935, to the final volume, The Age of Napoleon, in 1975, Will Durant and his wife, Ariel Durant, spent 40 years completing this 11-volume, 10-million-word masterpiece with nearly 1,000 illustrations. The entire set totals 13,549 pages, surveying the achievements of the human mind across 110 centuries. The writing process was also unusual. The first 6 volumes were written solely by Will Durant. From the 7th volume, The Age of Reason Begins, Ariel was listed as co-author. From then on, the Golden Anniversary couple worked side by side to complete this enduring work. In the last 3 or 4 volumes, the Durants would always say in their preface, "We are too old and unwell to continue writing. This may be the last volume." But a few years later, they would produce another volume, only to repeat the same words. By the time the final volume was published, Will was 90 and Ariel in her 80s. They had wanted to continue. Durant left notes for a 12th volume, The Age of Darwin, and an outline for a 13th, The Age of Einstein, intending to bring the story of civilization up to 1945. But half a lifetime of writing had exhausted them completely. Taiwanese scholars have called it the records of the grand historian of the 20th century and the Lee Saw of human civilization. This is no exaggeration. Since its publication, the series has garnered worldwide acclaim, earning the admiration of Ji Xianlin and the resonance of Tagore, becoming a treasured classic in 20 million households. The 10th volume, Rousseau and Revolution, won the 1968 Pulitzer Prize for Nonfiction, and the Durants were awarded the 1977 Presidential Medal of Freedom. However, before we open the first volume, we need to place it in context. In the world of historiography, Durant's The Story of Civilization and Stavriano's as a Global History are regarded as twin peaks. Although both are monumental works on human civilization, their perspectives, narrative focuses, and writing styles differ fundamentally. Understanding these differences helps us more quickly enter Durant's civilization world. In narrative perspective, Durant employs a traditional and classic time-region vertical axis. He tends to view civilization as a relay race, starting in the East, passing to Greece and Rome, then to medieval Europe and the Renaissance. Although the first volume covers the East, the remaining 10 volumes focus primarily on the development of Western civilization. Stavriano's is a global history. By contrast, breaks free of Eurocentrism, adopting a macro perspective from outer space, focusing on the connections, collisions, and integrations between different civilizations. He writes about global interaction, while Durant writes about civilizational relay. In narrative focus, Durant focuses intensely on individuals, geniuses, ideas, and art. In his hands, history becomes a grand drama starring philosophers, artists, and political giants. He devotes extensive space to literature, philosophy, love, and secular life. He writes of the theater of human nature. Stavrianos, by contrast, focuses more on technological change, economic structures, and social institutions, analyzing patterns and trends. He writes about structures and patterns. In writing style, Durant is not only a historian but also a philosopher and essayist. His prose is beautiful, profound, and emotional, filled with reflections on human nature, morality, and destiny. Reading his books is like listening to a grand symphony, highly literary, but because of its vast scope, best suited for immersive reading. Stavrianos' language is concise, efficient, and objective, without sentimentality or redundant embellishment, reading more like a clearly structured global development report. In short, Stavrianos helps you build a framework, while Durant helps you fill in the flesh. If a global history is a detailed map of global civilization, then the story of civilization is an immersive journey into the very scenes of those civilizations. Today, we will enter this biography of human civilization spanning 110 centuries to see what it says, how it says it, and why it remains worth reading. Station 1. Defining Civilization, Durant's Coordinates. Before opening the first volume, we need to answer a fundamental question. What exactly does Durant mean by civilization? Durant gives a concise yet profound definition at the outset of the story of civilization. Civilization is social order promoting cultural creation. For elements constitute it: economic provision, political organization, ethical traditions, and the pursuit of knowledge and the arts. In other words, civilization is not a pile of artifacts and buildings, but a living organism. It requires a material foundation, institutional safeguards, spiritual bonds, and creative drive. These four elements are indispensable, together constituting the life of civilization. In the first volume, Our Oriental Heritage, Durant further refines the elements of civilization into 8 factors: labor, farming, industry, transport and trade, government, morality, customs and manners, conscience and conduct, religion, science, philosophy, writing, and art. These 8 factors run through his study of every civilization. The first part of Our Oriental Heritage, The Establishment of Civilization, contains 6 chapters: the conditions of civilization, the economic conditions of civilization, the political conditions of civilization, the ethical conditions of civilization, the psychological conditions of civilization, and prehistoric civilization. In other words, before entering any specific civilization, Durant devotes 6 full chapters to answering: what is civilization? Why does it rise? Why does it fall? Durant's definition also has another important dimension. Civilization is not pure-blooded, but mixed. In his view, every great cultural flourishing is the result of collisions and fusions between different civilizations. Greek civilization was not born in a vacuum. It stood on the shoulders of Eastern civilizations, drawing from Egyptian mathematics, Babylonian astronomy, Indian philosophy, and Chinese technology. European civilization, likewise, did not create itself. It inherited its most important legacy from the East. The significance of this definition is that it liberates history from the traditional narrative of kings and wars. Durant cares about how the people of an era lived, worked, thought, and created. He writes the story of civilization, not the story of emperors. Station 2, Volume 1. Our Oriental Heritage, Civilization begins in the East. Durant does not begin with Greece or Rome. He chooses a starting point that was extremely rare in Western historiography at the time: the East. The first volume, Our Oriental Heritage, covers the history of the Middle East and the Eastern world up to 1933, divided into 4 parts. Part 1, The Establishment of Civilization, contains 6 chapters: the conditions of civilization, the economic conditions of civilization, the political conditions of civilization, the ethical conditions of civilization, the psychological conditions of civilization, and prehistoric civilization. Before entering any specific civilization, Durant builds a theoretical framework in 6 full chapters. He asks, why do civilizations rise in some places and stagnate in others? Durant's answer: civilization requires economic surplus. Without surplus, There is no specialization, no priests, artists, philosophers, or scientists. Civilization requires political order. Without order, there is no accumulation, no transmission. Civilization requires moral cohesion. Without shared ethics, society disintegrates. Civilization requires cultural creativity. Without the pursuit of knowledge and art, civilization ossifies. These four conditions are indispensable, forming the life foundation of civilization. Part 2, Egypt and the Near East, contains 7 chapters. This is the first specific civilization block Durant discusses. Sumer was humanity's first urban civilization. On the Mesopotamian plain, the Sumerians invented cuneiform, one of humanity's earliest writing systems. They invented the wheel, revolutionizing transport and warfare. They created a base, 60 mathematical system, from which we derive our division of time, 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute, and they formulated the world's earliest legal codes. Durant's writing on Sumer does not simply list firsts. He asks, how did these inventions change human life? Egypt developed along the Nile for nearly 3,000 years. The pyramids are Egypt's most famous symbol, but Durant is concerned with the people behind them, the farmers and craftsmen who built them. He writes about the architectural techniques of the pyramids, and more profoundly, about the worldview they reflect, the fear of death, the longing for immortality, and the belief in the pharaoh as a living god. The Egyptians invented hieroglyphics, created a complex polytheistic system, and developed advanced astronomy and medicine. Durant writes, Egyptian civilization lasted 3,000 years, longer than any later civilization. Its secret lay in the stable agriculture brought by the Nile's periodic flooding and the powerful cohesion of the pharaonic system. Babylon's Code of Hammurabi is the first written legal code in human history. Durant examines its contents in detail. It not only prescribed punishments, but also defined social hierarchy. Nobles, commoners, and slaves each had different rights and obligations. Durant notes that Babylon's contribution was not only law, but also astronomy. Babylonian priests precisely calculated planetary movements, laying the foundation for later scientific research. The Assyrian Empire was known for military conquest, uniting Mesopotamia under iron and fire. Durant writes of Assyria's war machine, its brutal rule, and its art. The reliefs in Assyrian palaces are among the most vivid historical records of the ancient world, depicting wars, hunts, and court life. Jewish civilization contributed monotheism, one of the most profound revolutions in human thought. Durant devotes an entire chapter to Jewish history, from Abraham's migration, to Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, to the kingdoms of David and Solomon, to the Babylonian exile, to the rebuilding of the Second Temple. Durant particularly focuses on Judaism's influence on later generations. Christianity and Islam are both rooted in Judaism, and monotheism fundamentally changed humanity's understanding of God, the world, and itself. The Persian Empire established an efficient administrative system, integrating vast territories of different peoples, religions, and cultures under one empire. Durant writes of Cyrus the Great's policy of tolerance. He allowed conquered peoples to retain their own religions and customs, which was extremely rare in the ancient world. Durant follows the same pattern in his treatment of every civilization. First geography and historical background, then political institutions, economic life, religion and philosophy, literature and art, and finally a conclusion summarizing the civilization's contributions to posterity. This structure runs through the entire work. Part 3, India and South Asia, contains 9 chapters. Durant's treatment of India is particularly brilliant. He does not merely write about Hindu gods, Buddhist teachings, or the rise and fall of the Mughal Empire. He also writes about the daily lives of the Indian people, Indian literature and art, and the influence of Indian thought on the world. He writes of the Buddha, not as a god, but as a man, a prince who renounced his throne, sought liberation, and finally attained enlightenment. He writes, Buddhism spread across all of Asia, from India to China, Japan, and Southeast Asia, influencing hundreds of millions of people. Indian philosophy influenced Western thinkers from Schopenhauer to Emerson. Indian mathematics invented the concept of zero, without which modern mathematics and science would not exist. Durant believes India's greatest contribution to the world was not any dynasty or war, but its spiritual legacy. Part 4, China and the Far East, contains 9 chapters. Durant's treatment of Chinese civilization was extraordinarily advanced for a Western historian of his time. He did not reduce China to that distant Eastern empire, but entered Chinese civilization with respect and curiosity. The Age of Philosophers covers the pre-Qin thinkers, Confucius, Laozi, Mozi, Mencius, Xuanzi. Durant's understanding of Confucius is quite perceptive. He recognized the essence of Confucianism as an ethical political philosophy rather than a religion. He writes, Confucius did not speak of gods and the afterlife. He concerned himself with how to establish order in this life, in this world, among people. Laozi's Tao is a completely different wisdom. It teaches harmony with nature, non-contention, and the triumph of softness over hardness. In the Age of Poets, Durant paints a vivid picture of the brilliance of Tang and Song poetry. Li Bai, Du Fu, Su Shi. He writes of Li Bai's untamed spirit. This immortal poet, drinking alone under the moon, lying drunk in Chang'an, expressing his ultimate pursuit of freedom in verse. He writes of Du Fu's concern for his country and people. How can I find 10,000 mansions to shelter all the poor scholars of the world? In which Durant sees the deepest moral concern of Chinese intellectuals. In the Age of Artists, he writes of Chinese painting, calligraphy, ceramics, and gardens. Durant notes that Chinese art pursues not likeness, but meaning. A landscape painting is not a reproduction of natural scenery, but an expression of nature's spirit. Chinese calligraphy transforms writing itself into art, each character an independent aesthetic world. In The People and the State, he writes of the lives of ordinary Chinese, their families, education, farming, and commerce. This approach was extremely rare in Western historical writing of the time. The book was published in 1935 at the height of Western colonialism. Durant's decision to dedicate the first volume to the East was itself a vision that transcended its era. Station 3, Volume 2, The Life of Greece, The Dawn of Reason. From the East, Durant arrives at the cradle of Western civilization, Greece. The Life of Greece was published in 1939. The volume is divided into 3 parts. Part 1, The Rise of Greece, contains 10 chapters. Durant begins with Crete, a civilization older than mainland Greece, the prelude to Greek civilization. Then comes the Mycenaean Age, the heroic world depicted in Homer's epics. In writing about Homer, Durant pays special attention to how these poems shaped Greek values: honor, courage, revenge, fate, themes that would recur throughout Greek civilization. Next comes Sparta and Athens, 2 city-states representing the extremes of Greek civilization. Sparta was the embodiment of military discipline, turning society into a war machine. Athens was the symbol of democracy and culture, turning society into a workshop of ideas. Durant contrasts these 2 models. Sparta produced warriors. Athens produced citizens. Sparta left legends. Athens left philosophy and art. In his chapter on the gods of Greece, Durant reveals the uniqueness of Greek religion. Greek gods were not omniscient or omnipotent. They had passions, jealousy, anger, love, fear. These human-like gods reflect the Greeks' profound acceptance of their own humanity. Part 2, The Golden Age of Greece, contains 8 chapters. This is one of the most brilliant sections of the entire work. Durant's Periclean Age, 461 to 429 BCE, is the zenith of Athens. The Parthenon was built during this period. The tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides were performed, and Socrates walked the streets of Athens. Durant does not merely write about the creations of these great figures. He also writes about Athenian work and wealth, Athenian morals and customs, how ordinary Athenians lived, loved, believed, and entertained themselves. He writes, Athenian democracy was not perfect. Women had no vote, slaves had no freedom, but it was humanity's first attempt to involve citizens in political decision-making. Chapter 7, The Literature of the Golden Age, focuses on the 3 great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and the comic playwright Aristophanes. Durant analyzes how tragedy reflects the Greeks' profound reflections on fate, justice, and human nature. Chapter 8, The Self-Destruction of Greece, is one of the most tragic chapters in the entire work. Durant describes in detail how the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, destroyed Athens' Golden Age. This was a mortal struggle between Athens and Sparta, lasting nearly 30 years, ending in Athens' defeat. Durant concludes, Greece's decline was not the result of foreign invasion, but of Greeks killing Greeks. Part 3, The Decline of Greece, contains 12 chapters. This part tells the long process of Greece's decline from its peak. Philip of Macedon conquered the Greek city-states. His son Alexander brought Greek culture to the entire known world. Durant's portrayal of Alexander is ambivalent. He acknowledges Alexander's military genius, but also reveals his ambition and cruelty. In The Zenith of Philosophy, Durant focuses on Plato and Aristotle, the two peaks of Greek philosophy and the foundation of all Western philosophy. He writes of Plato's theory of forms, the world divided into the visible and the intelligible, truth found not in the senses but in thought. He writes of Aristotle's logic, syllogism, categories, substance, tools that remain basic to Western thought. In The Zenith of Greek Science, he introduces Greek achievements in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and geography, Euclid's geometry, Archimedes' physics, Hippocrates' medicine, Ptolemy's astronomy, which form the basis of modern science. The conclusion of the second volume is The Legacy of Greece. Durant summarizes Greece's contributions to later generations, the idea of democracy, the method of philosophy, the ideal of art, the quest of science. He writes, Greece did not create an eternal civilization, but it created an eternal model. Durant believes that Greek civilization is in every way a miniature of our own civilization today. Every civilized nation is, in all matters of intellectual activity, a colony of Greece. Station 4, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, The Rise of Rome and the Conquest of Monotheism. Caesar and Christ was published in 1944. This is one of the most dramatic volumes in the series, the 1,000-year struggle between an empire and a religion. This volume is divided into two parts. Part 1, The Age of Caesar, begins with the Etruscans, an Italian civilization older than Rome that profoundly influenced it. Then comes the rise of the Roman Republic, from a small city-state to the master of the Mediterranean. Durant describes in detail the three Punic Wars, especially Hannibal's crossing of the Alps and his 16-year rampage through Italy. But behind the glory of the Roman Republic lay deep crises: wealth inequality, land consolidation, peasant bankruptcy, slave revolts. The failed reforms of the Gracchi brothers, the civil wars of Marius and Sulla, the slave revolt of Spartacus. Durant describes how the Roman Republic moved from republic to empire. Durant devotes an entire chapter to Caesar. He writes of Caesar's military genius, the conquest of Gaul, the crossing of the Rubicon, the defeat of Pompey, and also of Caesar's political machinations, how he step by step turned Rome's republican institutions into tools of his own autocracy. Durant's judgment of Caesar is complex. He was both a great and a dangerous figure. He ended the chaos of the Roman Republic, but also buried its liberty. Durant's treatment of Rome has a central theme: Rome's failure. The Roman Republic had been a polity based on the rule of law and civic virtue, but was ultimately destroyed by internal corruption, class conflict, and military dictatorship. Durant describes in detail how Rome went from republic to empire, a process not sudden, but a gradual loss of freedom, a gradual acceptance of authoritarian rule. He points out, the fall of the Roman Empire was neither due to barbarian invasions nor to the rise of Christianity. In fact, by the time the barbarians invaded and Christianity flourished, the Roman Empire was already an empty shell. The basic causes of Rome's decline lay in its people, its moral climate, class struggle, commercial decline, bureaucratic despotism, heavy taxation, and costly wars. Part 2, The Age of Christ, tells how Christianity grew from a small sect to the dominant faith of the Roman Empire and all of Europe. Durant traces the foundational role of Jewish tradition in shaping Christianity, presents the life of Jesus and the development of the early church, and explains the conflict and fusion between the new religion and traditional Roman beliefs. Durant does not view Christianity simply as miracle, but analyzes the social and psychological reasons for its success. It answered the deep longings of late Roman society for redemption, meaning, and community. In an age of uncertainty, Christianity offered certainty. In an age of moral confusion, it offered clear rules. In an age of social disintegration, it offered a new community. Rome's lesson: if a civilization cannot solve its internal inequalities and social injustices, external enemies will eventually come knocking. Station 5, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, a 1,000-year spiritual empire. The Age of Faith was published in 1950. This is one of the longest volumes in the series, in two parts. It covers the Middle Ages from the fall of Rome to Dante. In traditional historical narratives, the Middle Ages are often depicted as a dark age, a millennium of civilizational decline, intellectual stagnation, and religious oppression. But Durant rejects this simplistic label. He sees another side to the Middle Ages. It was an age of faith, but also an age of creation. Durant notes that from 325 to 1300, the medieval world converged and stirred with four different cultures: Byzantine, Islamic, Jewish, and Western European. Vast regions of the world continued under the banner and rule of faith, while Western Europe sailed into a distant ocean of reason. Medieval people were first victims of barbarism, then conquerors of barbarism, and finally creators of a new civilization. This volume begins with the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire that lasted nearly 1,000 years, preserving the cultural heritage of Greece and Rome. Durant writes of Justinian's conquests and legal codification, the architectural wonder of Hagia Sophia, and Byzantine art and theological debates. Then comes the brilliance of Islamic civilization. Durant discusses the enormous achievements of Islamic civilization in science, philosophy, medicine, and art. Islamic scholars preserved and developed Greek philosophy and science, Arabic numerals, algebra, chemistry, which changed the course of human civilization. Durant's cross-civilizational vision allows him to see Islamic civilization not as an other, but as a dialogue partner and teacher of European civilization. Jewish civilization continued to develop in the Middle Ages. The Talmud was completed during this period, and Jewish scholars served as cultural bridges between the Islamic and Christian worlds. Western Europe gradually recovered from the barbarian invasions of the early Middle Ages. Durant writes of feudalism and chivalry, institutions that, though crude, provided the foundation for later rule of law and civilizational order. He writes of the economic revolution, 1066 to 1300, the revival of trade, the rise of cities, the emergence of a middle class. He writes of the recovery of Europe, 1095 to 1300. The Crusades, though bringing violence and religious fervor, also opened Europe to contact with the East. In Part 3, The Climax of Christianity, Durant delves into the religious and cultural achievements of the Middle Ages. He writes of the organizational structure and influence of the Roman Catholic Church, of the early Inquisition, a complex institution that both defended faith and suppressed dissent. He writes of the monastic and mendicant movements, the rise of the Franciscans and Dominicans, representing the revival and reform of medieval religious life. Gothic architecture is the most magnificent material expression of the Age of Faith. From Chartres Cathedral to Notre Dame de Paris, Durant describes with delicate strokes the aesthetic and religious significance of these buildings. Pointed arches, flying buttresses, rose windows, technologies that were not merely architectural breakthroughs, but material expressions of faith. Scholastic philosophy attempted to understand faith through reason. From Anselm to Aquinas, the scholastics carved out a legitimate space for reason. Durant pays special attention to Thomas Aquinas, who tried to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian faith. This spirit of faith-seeking understanding is one of the most important legacies the Middle Ages left to the modern world. Durant's assessment of the Middle Ages is complex and balanced. The medieval legacy contains both good and evil. We have not recovered from the Dark Ages. In this sense, modernity is a cloak worn over medievalism. Station 6, Volume 5, The Renaissance, The Awakening of Man. The Renaissance tells the story of Italy's cultural rebirth from the 14th to the 16th century. The aim of this volume is to give a detailed description of every aspect of Italian life during the Renaissance, from the birth of Petrarch to the death of Titian. Durant notes that the term Renaissance in this volume refers only to Italy. The reason is that the Renaissance was the result of the natural maturation of Italy's native culture, not the germination of a foreign cultural enlightenment. Moreover, in Italy, even the revival of classical literature was overemphasized. For Italy, classical revival was no more important than the economic and cultural developments that shaped its distinctive style. Durant's treatment of the Renaissance is full of passion. He vividly portrays the cultural flourishing of Florence, Venice, Rome, and other cities. The Renaissance was an awakening of man. In the Middle Ages, human gaze was directed primarily toward heaven. In the Renaissance, it returned to earth. Italians grew tired of original sin, affirmed the health and beauty of life, celebrated joy, and no longer feared death. The sunlight of the Italian spirit penetrated the northern mists. He writes of Petrarch, the first modern man, who climbed Mount Ventoux not for pilgrimage but to enjoy the view. He writes of Boccaccio, whose Decameron mocked the hypocrisy of the church with worldly tales. He writes of Machiavelli, whose The Prince revealed the cold reality of politics. In the arts, Durant writes of Leonardo da Vinci, not merely a painter but a scientist, engineer, anatomist, the perfect embodiment of the Renaissance man. He writes of Michelangelo, sculptor, painter, architect, poet, whose works are filled with power and the sanctification of the human body. He writes of Raphael, perfect harmony and grace. But he is concerned with more than art. The relationship between the Renaissance and power, the Medici, the popes, the Venetian merchants, the art and ideas of the Renaissance depended on the support of power and wealth. Durant reveals the complex and ambiguous relationship between art and power. The dark side of the Renaissance. This was a glorious age, but also a cruel one. Machiavelli's The Prince revealed the cold reality of politics. Wars between Italian city-states never ceased. The fires of the Inquisition still burned. Durant never romanticizes the Renaissance. The legacy of the Renaissance. The Renaissance changed not only art, but also human self-understanding. It laid the foundations of modern individualism, opened the door to the scientific revolution, and shaped the basic contours of Western modernity. Station 7, Volume 6, The Reformation, the Division of Faith. The Reformation tells the story of Europe's religious transformation in the 16th century. Durant points out that the Renaissance and the Reformation are the two sources of modern history, the opposing sources of modern intellectual and moral purification. The Reformation condemned the pleasures of the Renaissance, holding that worldly achievement and joy were worthless, that life was but a veil of tears, and summoned sinners to faith and repentance. It was almost a reaction against the Middle Ages. Durant brings several unique perspectives to this period. From Wycliffe to Luther, Durant traces the forerunners of the Reformation, including England's Wycliffe, Bohemia's Huss, and the humanist Erasmus. Erasmus tried to find a middle path between Luther and the Church. Although he ultimately failed, his ideas influenced the later Enlightenment. Martin Luther's posting of the 95 Theses in 1517 is generally seen as the starting point of the Reformation. Durant describes in detail how Luther's ideas, justification by faith, sola scriptura, ignited a religious revolution in Germany. He writes, Luther wanted only to reform the Church, but ended up dividing Christendom. The relationship between the Reformation and economic change. Durant notes that the Reformation was not merely a theological event. It was closely connected to the rise of capitalism, the spread of printing, and the awakening of national consciousness. Protestant justification by faith had a deep spiritual resonance with the individualism of the rising bourgeoisie. Luther's German translation of the Bible not only changed religion, but also transformed the German language itself. John Calvin. Durant describes in detail Calvin's theocratic republic in Geneva. Calvin's Geneva was a strict religious republic, but its institutions, elected elders, church autonomy, provided a template for later democratic politics. Calvinism spread to France, the Netherlands, Scotland, and North America, shaping the ethics and politics of the Protestant world. The violence of the religious wars, from the German Peasants' War to the French Wars of Religion, from the Dutch Revolt to the English Puritan Revolution, the Reformation brought a century of bloody conflict. But Durant also notes that this was also an age when the idea of tolerance began to emerge. From Erasmus to Montaigne, some began to call for religious tolerance and intellectual freedom. Station 8, Volumes 7 to 9, The Dawn of Reason and the Light of Enlightenment. From the 7th volume onward, Ariel Durant formally joined the writing. These 3 volumes together tell the profound transformation of European thought from the 17th to the 18th centuries, the shift from religious to rational authority. Volume 7, The Age of Reason Begins, covers Europe from the accession of Elizabeth I, 1558, to the end of the 30 Years' War, 1648. This period is a key chapter in understanding modern Europe. Its basic development is the rise of national sovereignty and the decline of theology and papal power. The results of the Reformation began to manifest across Europe. Durant writes of Bacon, Shakespeare, Galileo, Descartes, Hobbes, how these thinkers challenged traditional authority and made room for reason. The 30 Years' War was the climax of the religious wars and the key to the reshaping of Europe's political landscape. Volume 8, The Age of Louis XIV, covers from the Peace of Westphalia to the death of Louis XIV. France reached its cultural and artistic peak under the Sun King. Durant weaves political and cultural history together to present the full picture of an era. Louis XIV Versailles was a symbol of absolute monarchy, but also of French cultural flourishing. Molière, Racine, La Fontaine, and French painting, architecture, and garden art. The theme of this age was the great debate between faith and reason. Faith still occupied the throne, but reason bloomed in the new ideas of Hobbes, Locke, Newton, Spinoza, and Leibniz. Thinkers devoted themselves to intellectual exploration. Durant also writes of Dutch democracy, which cast a ray of light on monarchical Europe, and England's Glorious Revolution, which laid the foundation for later rule of law and liberty. Volume 9, The Age of Voltaire, is not a biography of Voltaire, but uses his colorful life as a thread connecting nations and generations, presenting European civilization from the death of Louis XIV to the fall of the Bastille. The widespread and persistent conflict between religion, science, and philosophy constitutes a vivid historical drama of the 18th century. Durant describes in detail Voltaire's life and thought, his exile, his loves, his friendship and rupture with Frederick the Great. But Durant does not deify Voltaire. He writes of Voltaire's contradictions and limitations. He was both a defender of freedom and an elitist, both critical of religion and believing it a necessary restraint for ordinary people. Durant also writes of other giants of the Enlightenment, Montesquieu, Diderot, Rousseau. This volume paints a group portrait of thinkers led by Voltaire. Our relative freedom of thought, speech, and belief today owes much to the 18th century Enlightenment thinkers. Station 9, Volume 10, Rousseau and Revolution. The Glory of the Pulitzer Prize. Volume 10, Rousseau and Revolution, published in 1967, is the most honored volume of the entire work, winning the 1968 Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. This volume focuses on European history from the Seven Years' War, 1756, to the French Revolution, 1789, with Rousseau's thought as the main thread, analyzing the decline of absolutism, religious change, and the germination of democracy, covering politics, economics, military affairs, philosophy, and the arts. It weaves together the lives of Voltaire, Catherine the Great, Frederick the Great, and others. Rousseau was the direct intellectual force behind the French Revolution. He created nothing, yet set everything ablaze. The core tension of this volume is the Enlightenment was both a liberating and a destructive force. On one hand, the Enlightenment brought the ideals of reason, science, human rights, and democracy, laying the intellectual foundation for the modern world. Rousseau's social contract proposed the idea of popular sovereignty. The power of government comes from the consent of the people, not from God or tradition. Diderot's encyclopedia sought to systematize all human knowledge for the enlightenment of ordinary readers. On the other hand, the radicalism of the Enlightenment also led to the terror of the French Revolution. Under the banner of reason, the guillotine turned. Under the banner of liberty, tyranny flourished. Durant's treatment of the French Revolution is both brilliant and restrained. He neither celebrates it simply as a victory of the people nor condemns it as an orgy of the mob, but deeply analyzes its social roots, intellectual causes, and historical consequences. He writes both of the idealism of 1789 and the terror of 1793, both the glory of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the paranoia of Robespierre. The Durants wrote in the preface to the 10th volume, "We found ourselves exhausted by the time we reached the French Revolution." This is both a literal physical description and a profound metaphor. The Enlightenment brought humanity to a new height, but also exhausted the energy of an era. This volume's Pulitzer Prize was no accident. It represents the peak of Durant's historical writing. Grand historical vision combined with delicate characterization, intellectual depth combined with narrative charm. Station 10, Volume 11, The Age of Napoleon, The Fall of a Giant. The Age of Napoleon, published in 1975, is the concluding volume of the entire work. It focuses on the development of European civilization from 1789 to 1815, covering politics, war, economy, morality, manners, religion, science, medicine, philosophy, literature, drama, music, and art. The volume also includes the chapter, The Lessons of History, analyzing the patterns of civilizational development from the perspectives of geography, race, morality, and more, distilling the historical framework of the entire series. Napoleon is Durant's chosen full stop, not because he was a perfect endpoint, but because he was a perfect turning point. Napoleon represented both the last glory of the old order and the first light of the new order. Napoleon was a dictator without precedent, and one of the most charismatic dreamers and practitioners in human history. Durant's portrayal of Napoleon is full of tension. He writes of Napoleon's genius, military ability, administrative talent, legislative skill. He also writes of his flaws, boundless ambition, ruthless calculation, and final consumption by his own ambition. After Napoleon's empire collapsed, the Congress of Vienna redrew the map of Europe. The old order tried to return, but the seeds of revolution had already been sown. Nationalism, liberalism, democracy. These flames ignited in the Napoleonic era would burn across Europe in the century to come. By the time the Durants completed the 11th volume, Will was 90 and Ariel in her 80s. They knew this might be the last. Yet they still left notes for a 12th volume, The Age of Darwin, and an outline for a 13th, The Age of Einstein, intending to bring the story of civilization up to 1945. Station 11, The Writing Perspective, Complete History and Synthetic History. Having covered the contents of all 11 volumes, we must ask a deeper question. What perspective did Durant use to write this work? Durant's writing perspective can be summarized in 4 keywords. First, complete history. Durant refused to cut history into separate fragments of political, economic, cultural, and military history. He believed history was a whole. The politics, economy, culture, religion, and art of an era are different aspects of a single organism. To understand an era, one must understand its economic foundation, political institutions, religious beliefs, philosophical ideas, artistic achievements, and daily life. He adopted an integrated historical method, that is, giving a general introduction to every aspect of each culture or era. Second, cultural history rather than war history. Traditional historical works often take wars and political events as their main thread. Durant focuses on cultural creation, philosophy, science, literature, art, religion, morality. He is concerned with the achievements of the human mind, not the deeds of emperors and generals. In Durant's view, the true marker of civilization is not how much land a country can conquer, but how much cultural value it can create. Third, the thread of intellectual history. Durant uses the evolution of ideas as his main thread through horizontal comparison and vertical analysis, revealing the rise and fall of different civilizations. He writes of Greece not only as Athens and Sparta at war, but as Plato, Aristotle, and Sophocles thinking. He writes of the Renaissance not only as Medici politics, but as the creations of Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Machiavelli. He believes that ideas are the deep driving force of history. Material conditions provide possibilities, but ideas determine direction. Fourth, civilizational history rather than national history. Durant breaks down national and disciplinary boundaries, narrating history by civilization and era. He is not writing French history, English history, or German history, but Greek civilization, Roman civilization, Christian civilization, Renaissance civilization. This approach emphasizes the continuity and transregionality of civilization. Civilization does not exist in isolation, but develops through exchange and collision with other civilizations. Station 12, The Narrative Focus, How Civilization Becomes the Protagonist. Having established the perspective, we must also ask, what does Durant focus on in his narrative? First, the rise and fall of civilizations. Durant is most concerned with why some civilizations rise and others fall. In the Lessons of History, he summarizes the laws of civilizational rise and fall. A civilization's rise requires economic foundation, political order, moral cohesion, and cultural creativity. Decline often begins with internal moral decay, political corruption, and cultural stagnation. External invasion is often the last straw, but the real cause lies within. Second, the interaction between great figures and the spirit of the age. Durant values both the shaping role of great figures and the constraints of the spirit of the age. Caesar was a turning point in Roman history, but without the social crisis of the late Republic, there would have been no Caesar. Rousseau was a forerunner of the French Revolution, but without the internal contradictions of the old regime, there would have been no Rousseau. Third, exchange and influence between civilizations. Durant pays special attention to interaction between different civilizations. How did Eastern civilization influence Greece? How did Greece influence Rome? How did Islamic civilization influence Europe? What did China and India contribute to world civilization? In Durant's view, civilization is not pure-blooded, but mixed-blooded. Every great cultural flourishing is the result of collision and fusion between civilizations. Fourth, the lives of ordinary people. Although Durant writes extensive biographies of great figures, he never forgets ordinary people. He writes of the life of the people in an era, how they worked, loved, believed, and entertained themselves. In his view, the true achievement of civilization lies not in the creations of a few geniuses, but in whether the quality of life of ordinary people has improved. Station 13, The Language Style, How the Storyteller Brings History to Life. Durant's language style is perhaps his most distinguishing feature as a historian. First, storytelling. Durant is the greatest storyteller of the 20th century. He writes history as if telling a story, with plot, characters, conflict, and suspense. He does not list facts, but narrates stories. The word story in the title is no accident. Second, accessibility and flow. Durant's prose is described as accessible, flowing, and pleasantly witty. He devotes himself to liberating philosophy and knowledge from the academic ivory tower, making the complex understandable. He avoids obscure terminology and tedious citations, instead using language that ordinary readers can understand to convey profound historical insights. Third, balance between depth and readability. Durant's books are not simple popularizations. They have depth, insight, and critical thinking, but he wraps these depths in flowing narrative, allowing readers to learn history while reading stories. Fourth, fusion of passion and talent. Durant is not a detached, objective historian. He is a passionate participant in human civilization. His passion infects his words, allowing readers to feel his love and awe for civilization. Fifth, memorable aphorisms. Durant's books are filled with memorable aphorisms. These sentences are both concise and profound, staying with readers long after they finish. Station 14, influence and controversy. Why it is still read today. The story of civilization has generated strong reactions around the world since its publication. It is hailed as the records of the grand historian of the 20th century and the Lee Saw of human civilization. 20 million households worldwide have collected this set. It ranks among the most successful historical series ever, serving as an introduction for middle school, college, and graduate students. But it is not without controversy. On one hand, it is an extremely comprehensive encyclopedia of human civilization. It covers politics, economy, military, technology, religion, culture, philosophy, history, education, art, music, and more. It integrates vast historical details into accessible knowledge, overcoming the increasing fragmentation and specialization of historical narrative, and striving to refine a holistic historical insight. On the other hand, it also faces criticism. Some commentators note that the series ignores some regions of the world and underestimates others. Although Durant broke with Eurocentric prejudice, his narrative focus remains on the West. Moreover, some of the book's views are considered tinged with early 20th century pseudoscience. Some contemporary scholars believe certain judgments are outdated. Nevertheless, the value of this work is indisputable. As one reader said, "Nothing is more comprehensive than this." I love it. Station 15, an indirect history Durant never excavated. Is it credible? At this point, we must confront the sharpest question. Durant never personally excavated a single artifact. His entire work is based on secondary sources. How credible is a 10 million-word work that relies entirely on second-hand accounts? This question is direct and legitimate. To answer it, we need to examine it from several levels. First, the era and purpose of its creation. The story of civilization began in 1935. In that era, accessing primary archaeological reports, original documents, and fieldwork data was far more difficult than it is today. Durant was neither an archaeologist nor a specialist historical researcher, but a professor of philosophy and a popular history writer. His original intention in writing this work was not to contribute new original discoveries to academia, but to synthesize and narrate existing knowledge for ordinary readers. This is a synthetic history, not original research. Durant himself acknowledged this in the preface to the first volume. He was organizing, interpreting, and presenting the work of others. Second, the inherent limitations and value of synthesis. No work attempting to cover the entire history of human civilization can achieve professional depth in every civilization, period, and field. Durant faced thousands of years of human history, dozens of civilizations, hundreds of important figures, and thousands of key events. He had to choose what to cover in detail and what to skim, what to emphasize, and what to omit. Behind these choices lay both the author's judgment and his intellectual boundaries and the limitations of his era. Third, inevitable obsolescence. From 1935 to 1975, world archaeology and history developed rapidly. When Durant wrote the first volume, many key archaeological discoveries had not yet been made. For example, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered between 1946 and 1956, completely changing scholars' understanding of early Judaism and Christianity. The Terracotta Army in Xi'an was discovered in 1974, providing unprecedented material evidence for the study of the Qin dynasty. In-depth research on Maya and Inca civilizations also only made breakthroughs after Durant's writing. This means that descriptions of these civilizations in the book are inevitably incomplete or inaccurate by today's standards. Fourth, personal style and potential bias. Durant's writing has a strong personal character. He not only narrates facts but also expresses opinions, makes moral judgments, and offers philosophical reflections. This makes the story of civilization more like a civilizational meditation than an objective historical record. As a Western intellectual of the early 20th century, Durant inevitably carried the cognitive limitations of his time. For example, his treatment of Chinese and Indian civilizations, while far beyond that of his Western contemporaries, still contained misunderstandings. His optimistic belief in progress and reason may seem overly simplistic today. His discussion of Islamic civilization is not entirely precise in some details. Fifth, how should we view this work? So how should we use this work? My suggestion is, treat it as a guide map to civilization, not a textbook of civilization. Durant offers a paper museum of civilization. Using beautiful language and grand narrative, he outlines the important landmarks of civilization. But it is only a map, not a report on each brick. Enjoy its stories, not its truths. The greatest reward of reading the story of civilization is not remembering that something happened on a certain date, but feeling the overall trajectory of human civilization, the passion and struggle of thinkers, the collision of art and faith. It is a narrative experience, not a list of facts. Maintain critical thinking. Be alert to content that does not align with current academic consensus, especially regarding non-Western civilizations. It is best to read with more up-to-date specialized research. See it as a starting point, not an end point. When you develop a strong interest in a particular civilization or period, do not stop at Durant. Seek out more specialized and modern works for deeper study. Final station. Why does this story of civilization deserve to be heard? Looking back over the 11-volume journey of the story of civilization, from the Eastern heritage to Greek life, from Caesar and Christ to the Age of Faith, from the Renaissance to the Reformation, from the Age of Reason to Louis XIV, Voltaire, Rousseau, and finally Napoleon, we see not only a historical work, but a hymn to the human spirit. Durant's way of measuring history with his life transcends the category of ordinary history books. He is not writing history, but telling the story of civilization. His goal is to help us know ourselves, to know where we come from, what we are, and where we are going. Despite its deficiencies in retelling and its historical limitations, its value remains irreplaceable. It is a key that can unlock your desire for exploration, not a standard answer to be memorized. Durant believed that the true purpose of grasping history is to enable people to re-examine present life from a broader perspective and make more prudent choices for the continuation of civilization. In this age of uncertainty, economic turmoil, environmental crisis, the rise of AI, we need this broader perspective more than ever. The Durants used half their lives to make a pilgrimage across time and space. They showed us that human civilization is not a pile of fragments, but an organic whole, not a straight line, but a river full of twists and turns, yet generally flowing upward. Perhaps the best conclusion comes from the lessons of history. Unless man himself becomes meaningful, human existence will be meaningless. The story of civilization is the story of humanity's search for meaning. Thank you for listening to today's deep exploration. By books, we gain wisdom. By history, we understand the rise and fall of nations. I am Lawrence Stardust. See you next time.